Hello! Okay, welcome to a retro movie review, and this one is for 1994's The Crow, directed by Alex Proyas. It's based on a 1989 comic book series, and I think I'm going to surprise a lot of people here. I've never watched this movie before until a couple of nights ago at its 30th anniversary screening. I know it's been in my list of movies to check out for a very long time. I remember being a kid, seeing this film on VHS in rental shops and just really wanting to watch it, but I just never got around to checking it out. Even back when I was a kid, I've always been attracted to those darker, grittier stories within the superhero genre. So I am a little bit surprised on how I've actually never got around to watching this movie. But yeah, we had 30th anniversary screenings over the weekend, and I thought, well, why not? I couldn't think of a better opportunity to watch this movie for the first time other than on the big screen. So for those of you that don't know, the movie follows Eric Draven, a rock musician who is resurrected from the dead to seek vengeance against the gang who murdered him and his fiancée. So what did I think of 1994's The Crow? Well, for me, personally, it was very much a product of its time. It was also a very nostalgic experience. And yeah, yes, I haven't seen the film before, but it was nostalgic because I felt like the movie captures a certain era of filmmaking which I just absolutely miss and adore and appreciate. And that is when you've got these fantastical worlds that are brought to life through actually, practical effects and actual people on sets. And I just found myself really kind of missing these type of movies where, yes, you have a very fantastical story within sort of a fantastical setting, but it also feels very much real and grounded due to the fact that you can sort of, the world that these characters are living in feels real, it feels tangible due to how it's crafted and how they are brought together, how it's brought to life. And I just found myself this entire experience was quite nostalgic, but also it definitely transported me back to a certain sort of era and time of movies that were crafted without or very limited use of CGI. And I just loved how this very kind of dark, gothic aesthetic was brought to life throughout the movie. And this story, this narrative, has this kind of very high energy and momentum behind it. I felt like the entire experience was very relentless. It just doesn't stop with how the story moves. And a lot of it's done through these very quick edits and how the camera is utilized and how the camera moves through a lot of these moments and scenes. And I just ended up really digging it. Like, I felt like the way in which they told this story was very creative. And yes, as a result, I felt like I was missing a lot of character and sort of a lot of development when it comes to certain characters' relationships with each other. But just the way in which this story is told, based on sort of what the film is following, you've got this kind of this tragic love story of Eric Draven losing his fiancée. And I just felt like the way in which this story is told through the use of the camera and how the camera is utilized with these quick edits and sort of how it explores the transformation of Eric Draven to the Crow. The entire film, the entire experience had this kind of majestic quality to it. It was, the only way I can describe it was very elegant, especially when you get these moments of Eric Draven running on these rooftops, and I absolutely adored some of the shots and just how those scenes would play out. And yes, like I said, it's very fast. I felt like the energy with this narrative, it was very relentless. And in a way it shouldn't have worked, but for this type of story it was telling, for me, I just found myself really compelled and intrigued by it all and just how it came together. It can be messy in places, I felt, but overall I just felt like it had this kind of elegance to it that I really appreciated. And the same goes for a lot of the moments and scenes where the movie explores how Eric Draven sort of is struggling with his emotions internally and what it is that he's remembering that's happened in his past, and just how those scenes play out sort of with Eric Draven sort of thinking back to his fiancée and all of that. It was just very creative in how those moments were put together, and as a result do add to this kind of this elegance that I felt the movie had, this entire experience had. You know, this is a dark gothic story of a character who is seeking revenge for the death of his loved one who was brutally murdered, and all of sort of that aspect of the story is elevated through the way in which this film is crafted, and it's done, I thought, quite beautifully. And I love myself a good revenge story, and I think they do a fantastic job here at sort of bringing that aspect of the story to life. It is tragic, it's brutal, and I just really appreciated sort of how that part of the story when it comes to Eric Draven is brought to life. And emotionally, I am there with his character. Like, I cannot wait to see him get his revenge on those fuckers that killed his fiancée. But unfortunately for me, and it's due to the loss of development I felt between certain characters and the writing, especially when it comes to the movie's villains, I just felt like the overall film, the overall experience really sort of lacked that emotional punch, especially during the third act, that I felt like it needed. So you've got Michael Wincott playing the main villain, Top Dollar, and I completely forgot that Michael Wincott was in this movie. So when he shows up, I was like, yeah, fuck yeah, because I adore him as an actor. I think he does a wonderful job at bringing villains to life. He's got this kind of deep, raspy voice that's very iconic, and so yeah, he was great playing this character, and I just really liked how he brought the character to life. But what let the character down ultimately, and what kind of really bogs this entire experience down really in many ways, is the writing. The writing isn't the greatest, and the way in which that kind of plays into how the narrative flows, so that kind of very high energy, that kind of high energy and momentum, and just sort of missing, I feel, a lot of those moments with these characters and their relationships. It kind of really sort of, as a result, the entire experience lacks that kind of emotional depth that I felt like I was really, really wanting from this experience. Like, it does lack this kind of big emotional punch during the third act that I felt like the film needed. But a lot of that I felt was down to the writing, and, you know, nothing to do with the performances. Like, the performances all around are pretty solid, but I just feel like it's the writing mixed with how this narrative flows is what kind of really, as a result, ends up, for me anyway, lacking in that kind of real sort of deep emotional depth that I wanted from this journey. But I still couldn't help but be mesmerised and compelled, you know, by this experience and just how this world was brought to life. Brandon Lee, as the Crow, as Eric Draven, is great. I just loved how he brought the character to life. It's almost like he kind of really retains that kind of human element of the character, even though it becomes very supernatural. He does a good job at conveying the vulnerability and the pain that the character is going through. There's some really beautiful moments with his character that's very brief, but just the way in which he would say a certain line. Don't get me wrong, that the writing in this movie isn't great, but there are a couple of lines, especially with the character of Eric Draven and just how Brandon Lee sort of delivers those lines. It's quite heartbreaking, and yeah, it's a shame because as a whole, the writing just didn't work for me. But there are some real beautiful moments, especially with Brandon Lee, and somber moments that just sort of really kind of hit emotionally. This is one moment where he's speaking to this young girl. It's just after he saved her, and it's like, whoa, you know, and a lot of it is done through his performance. There were also a couple of moments within this movie, key moments, that reminded me or were very reminiscent of The Dark Knight. This is one scene, and from the way in which the scene plays out, through how the camera is used and how it follows Eric Draven. So it's the moment where Eric Draven enters the room with, you've got the main villain played by Michael Wincott, and he's at this table, and you've got all his other goons sat around the table, and just the way in which that scene was shot, following Eric Draven into that room, reminded me an awful lot of the scene and the moment from The Dark Knight with Heath Ledger's Joker. just even down from the way in which the camera is sort of positioned. Like, is that just me, or does anyone else get that vibe? And so I'm just wondering, was Christopher Nolan quite, in part inspired by this movie when it came to bringing The Dark Knight to life? With Heath Ledger's Joker, and there was a couple of other moments as well, but it was especially that moment, and I remember sitting there going, wow, that's very much like the scene from The Dark Knight with the Joker when he does the pencil trick. Is that just me? Let me know in the comments below. And before I wrap this review up, I just really need to touch on the score that was composed by a Graham Revel. I absolutely adored the music within this movie. It has this kind of very gothic, church-like sound to it that helped elevate the emotion in certain moments, but also sort of elevates that kind of supernatural aspect to the story when it comes to the character of Eric Draven. Yeah, the music just really accompanies this story beautiful in a way that it kind of really sort of helps elevate the emotions when the story needs it. It in many ways again sort of add into the majesticness and sort of the elegance of how the story, I felt, was told in moments as well. So yeah, really dug the score by a Graham Revel. I believe that's how you pronounce his name. So yeah, from a technical perspective, from the way in which this world was brought to life, for the use of the camera and how the narrative flows with the editing, it's the sort of the creative aspect, and how this story was brought to life from sort of a visual perspective. Like visually, the way in which this story is told, I felt was beautiful. Like I said, it has this kind of elegance to it. It's quite majestic, I felt. And there's some really nice, beautiful moments when it comes to the character of Eric Draven. But it's the writing and some of the performances, not all of the performances, but some of the performances and the development behind a lot of the characters and their relationships with one another is what sort of kind of let the film down for me. But overall, as a whole, I really enjoyed this movie, and I cannot believe it's taken me this long to just finally go and check it out. I'm glad, I'm so happy that I watched it for the first time on the big screen. It looked fantastic, it sounded beautiful, and even though the film isn't devoid of emotion, like I said, you've got the beautiful score as well as the great performance from Brandon Lee, and just the way in which the story is told from a technical perspective, there is still this kind of emotional current running through the film. Unfortunately, it does lack that kind of emotional punch that I felt like it needed. But yeah, I really enjoyed this experience. I really, really liked The Crow. And so yeah, they are my thoughts on The Crow. And I will be giving The Crow a 7.5 out of 10. So yeah, they are my thoughts on 1994's The Crow, but what do you guys think? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you agree or disagree with anything I've said? Then please let me know in the comments below, and let's get a discussion going. And if you want to watch future movie reviews from just some random Welsh geek rambling on, then please hit the subscribe button. It will mean an awful lot to me. My next movie review will be for Bad Boys Ride or Die. And so yeah, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll be catching you guys soon.